Welcome to Inside C Club, your peek behind the curtain of the Internet Native Accelerator. It's 2023, it's Q1, it's January 6th, and our C Club chat on Telegram is popping off. There's a lot of conversation about these things called tokens, and in particular, Jess has been putting out some hot takes on Twitter and have been, causing a little controversy as per usual. And I think we should surface what are these big hot takes and why do they matter? Maybe I'll start with this one. So, Jess, you posted this tweet on January 5th, and it says community token models need to be simple, clear, and easy. Make the token mechanics simple, what ownership represents clear, and the purchase easy. 98% of projects fail at this right now,
including C Club.
And we're fixing it. So, what does this actually mean?
Well, I think a lot of my sort of thinking in the last little while has come from conversations with Josh on what I think is just like a really great observation. All of my Twitter hot takes should be considered like thought experiments rather than truths, but maybe DAOs are more like consumer experiences, brands or products than they are like new ways of work or new types of organizations. And that maybe the core product of most DAOs, subset of DAOs, is ownership in the DAO. And the other thread I've been pulling on for a while is like, I think we treat the DAO, C Club, as the core product of the DAO, whether you call it a network, call it a platform, whatever you're building. And so making participation in ownership in collecting of whatever that is if you're selling anything, you want to make it very easy to go purchase it. And the whole sort of how do you overcome objections? And like, there's just these things that we know how to do in selling normal things or consumer things that I think might be really useful to apply to these networks that we're building. It's very clear when somebody goes and buys a Bored Ape Yacht Club or mints a Bored Ape, what they're getting. Like, that's a very easy thing. And I think that when we look at what an onboarding, even that word onboarding, what a purchase experience is like for C Club or for many of our DAOs or even for just most Web3 networks generally, we just make it very, very hard. And there's a lot of reasons for it. There's uncertainty and ambiguity and legality, and there's a lot of reasons why it can be a challenge. But it seems like just naming that and then trying to address it makes sense.
Can you just quickly clarify why you jumped from onboarding to purchasing there?
I think onboarding is a trope right now in DAOs that's not super helpful. Honestly, if I see another deck that says we're going to onboard the next billion users into Web3, I'm probably going to throw up. Who cares? It isn't our goal at C Club to onboard a bunch of people into C Club. There's specific objectives or specific experiences or value that people want to have when they join. And where we have that clear, like joining our accelerator, we see great success. Right. And I think there's still work to be done to make that even more clear. And where we don't have it, then I think I saw a reply to that tweet was like, well, actually, I found it incredibly convoluted to join C Club. And I thought that might have been on purpose because it means that only certain types of people actually get in. And I'm like, no, that's definitely not on purpose. It's just a bit of a mess.
Maybe I'll just jump in and share that like a big part of this like evolution in our thinking has come from just being captivated by what's happening in Nouns. And when you really like look at their product suite and what they've built, and then you compare it to, like Jess said, 98% of other DAOs, you don't have to look too far to understand why like so much capital and attention is going there. It's just so understandable and clear. And then I think like that coupled with, the realization that people aren't buying into Nouns and participating as like a form of work. They're doing it as a form of like entertainment, right? And like fun and community and participation. And like that looks much more like a consumer experience than it looks like the future of work.
I feel like the focus on it being a consumer experience is what actually might lead it to being the future of work. We talk about these things in such generalities, it's really challenging because I for sure see, we all work for a DAO. Today compared to 12 months ago, I don't know what the increase is, but it is a meaningful increase of the number of people who are actually working for DAOs. So there's very clearly new ways of working here. Jake Bruckman from CoinFund tweeted, what is the thing that gets us to 1 million person DAOs look like? And you think through that lens, it's probably more like being part of a community that owns a sports franchise and brand or owns a headless brand than it looks like is managing a DeFi protocol. Like MakerDAO has 50, 60 people that show up and watch their governance videos. Like, of course, high value, and creating immense value in the ecosystem. But there's a type of DAO that's going to be this sort of big, large consumer experience. And I think we just aren't, maybe I'll just speak for myself. I think we've sort of been playing around the edges of that. I think a lot of the teams that we work with, we look at what Marty's doing at Pool Suite, or we look at the Krause House team, or what Cabin's doing. Like, these are very clearly consumer experiences that I just don't feel like we've named it as such. And I think the response to that tweet maybe leads me to believe that other people haven't either.
Well, it's interesting. I think the reason that we haven't named it as such is because there's a lot of things that we're maybe taking for granted in this, and that like we wouldn't have called like blogging or streaming services or social media the future of work. But as soon as you have all of that and an ownership mechanism, that turns into this digitally native organization, and it's this whole next layer of something.
Can you unpack that a bit more? Like, there's something interesting there.
Yeah, I guess I'm just talking about DAOs as like they are a creator economy primitive. Nouns is a new primitive for the creator economy to coordinate in a more quote unquote formal way.
Yeah, I think there's this general thing that happens in crypto. This idea of like we're still early, and people joking that we're still early for 10 years, or that there aren't any good use cases, or it's all speculation. All these things seem to be byproducts of the fact that this is like a new technology that is launching in a hyper-connected world. The internet came around when there were still fax machines and phone lines and stuff. Facebook came around when there was, barely broadband. But now crypto's come around, and everybody's connected on Twitter. So there's like this self-referencing distribution of new ideas, and then we can also speculate on it, right? That's a new thing. Usually, new technology, like the internet, was around for 30, 40 years before the internet tech boom. Well, Bitcoin comes out, and it's 2-3 years later it happens. And so we're compressing these things down, and maybe that's the same thing with like these sort of evolutions in organizations and work and what that looks like. There's all these tools that exist out there that in their own innovation cycles were sort of additive, but when you bring them together, all of a sudden, maybe it is kind of like the frog boiling water. You're sort of sitting here and being like, oh, actually, like we can create the idea of like billion-dollar networks that are run and managed by small teams of people. We're seeing that in companies. We're going to see that in DAOs and in crypto if we haven't already. The ability to build multiple million following channels on the internet, like all these sort of things just kind of now exist that didn't exist. And maybe it's hard to sort of recognize the full impact of that.
Well, I think it actually feeds into this consumer narrative really well. And like, you recognize that Web3 and these communities or NFT projects, all this stuff is like competing with Web2 for, attention and participation and time. And like, truly because of the nascency of this industry, like the only real advantage we have right now in Web3 is the speculation ownership, right? Like for the value fully to be realized, like the product, the like experience stuff needs to catch up. And I think that's going to be like the massive unlock for the future of this, when like, consumer experiences with embedded ownership are much more compelling to use than today's like existing nice, easy to use like Web2 consumer experiences.
Josh, can you talk about a little bit from how what you just said relates to Nouns? Like how does Nouns feel like it captures some of that insight that you're talking about?
Yeah, totally. I mean, let's look at the two examples, right? One is, your typical DAO today where their like core CTA is join our Discord, and you click that and, you kind of fall down this rabbit hole of like channels and threads, and it's impossible to even understand anything, right? And then, you go to Nouns, and their kind of like top level site is this kind of ownership narrative. And then, you go a level deeper, and they have just this full product suite that once you do have ownership, allows you to go to a place to actually like participate in allocating capital and like deciding on what matters for the DAO to do. And then you go to the other place, and it's participating in like proposals and governance and kind of like making sense of the strategy and the opportunity. And that's all this like super easy to navigate and like participate in thing that is just like so orders of magnitude better than the majority of alternatives out there today.
Yeah, I think the thing that sort of breaks my brain a little bit is around when the thing that needs to get done is driving more than sort of the like nascent emergent pieces from the community, and how an organization or how, pieces of work get pushed forward in a much more traditional type of framework, but using this type of model. And I think that that's the piece, because I think that like, yeah, we look at the creator economy and that like didn't exist. And that sort of whole idea of like user generated content, and that's something that now is a full industry and career trajectory. But there's also DAOs, like Seed Club, for example, pushing forward like pieces of work where we're on the hook for these like long-term pieces that we've committed to. And so I think that that's the piece that like really is interesting and like also breaks my brain a little bit. The tension between like the objectives and the deliverables, while having that like truly decentralized model where decentralization is baked in from like the very first iteration of the contract.
I think public assembly is really approaching this in a sick way, in that within public assembly, there's a studio that uses the hex code of the pink number that they like. And that studio puts forward proposals to the DAO, but they work as a studio within themselves and as a team. So they can still have those long-term goals within that larger DAO framework. it's kind of like what people were calling pods and sub DAOs and stuff, right? But it's like they are still the instigators of that network.
Exactly. Yeah. I think it goes back to this other sort of realization and core hunch that we're working through within Seed Club, but we're seeing just generally. And it goes back to even to like sort of why bounties was something that just like never really jived for me, which is that like ultimately the folks that are committed to the work on the long term and know the work really deeply are the ones that are going to be best able to push that work forward. But I think that how you square that with ownership and again, this decentralization is something that we're all still trying to figure out, Seed Club included.
I think one of the tweets I have loaded up, ready to go, is that I think Nouns is going to be both a valuable project and also probably not the right model for most teams, but also still a valuable model for many. What's really interesting with the Nouns model is it is pushing that coordination off to the edges. So yeah, you would have, like you see this in the Prop House team, you see this in the Agora team, you see this in, there's multiple rounds of funding that have happened. They're carrying forth product vision. It's a core team that is working on them. And it actually makes that a lot more clear, right? The network is the funder, the coordinator of capital, and the coordination of work is actually done in these small pods. I think that's TBD on how that works long term. And I think you look at a lot of like the discussion around the continuous funding of some of these open source tools and asking like, well, how long are we going to continue to put $1 million into backing Prop House before Prop House should stand up on its own? And how does value flow back into Nouns, and should it flow back more directly? So I think there's a lot of figuring out there. But I think like the challenge I see with it is like, I think there's a lot of builders who would not want to go and compete with token holders or other folks to go build their vision. And so I think that's why there's like this headless brand. I think like the open source software development, product development, I think there's like a big juicy sort of meta around the meme, the brand space that the Nouns model is going to work really well for. And also, if you believe brilliant people who have some sort of obsession, weirdness about them, trauma, whatever it is ultimately what leads to innovative products. I stand by my word trauma. That figuring out what the right structure is to enable those people to bring great things to the world, and then how and when community ownership makes sense there, I think is really interesting. It just makes me think that the world is definitely much bigger than any one of these models. But I think the thing we're talking about here is like thinking about the network as a consumer product. And to me, it's almost like what is the right timing for that? Like there's one model where builders should go build the thing, and then community ownership is like this steroids or a caffeine boost, right? That all of a sudden you get the growth loops right. There's incentives that layer on. It's like, what might yield farming in a sustainable way applied to a consumer product might look like? I don't know, kind of a cool thought. For other products, it's just going to make a lot more sense to start off as a community owned from day one. And this funding mechanism that Nouns has built, I think is going to lead. I think this idea of like labs versus nounish is like a really helpful distinction, and without judgment on either of those, just saying like for certain projects, a labs model is going to make the most sense. And for certain builders, that's the path they're going to want to go down. And for others, this nounish model. But both, when you come to the point of view of like launching the network, I think this thesis of the network as a consumer product still holds true. It's just like, in Nouns, it's like the people who own these tokens aren't doing the work for the most part.
Can you just unpack that a little bit more? What do you mean by network as a consumer product?
Okay, so one of the things I think about a lot is like, why do people buy tokens? Why do people hold tokens? And we can tell ourselves it's because of the incredible utility that these tokens provide us. But in reality, I think it's mostly a belief in the future, a belief in a narrative. And so I think while many people, Ethereum and Bitcoin, I think very clearly have utility use cases, there is still a bigger narrative use case or brand or belief or meme, if you will, that sort of fits into this. And so I think that's sort of like the framing I look at most tokens from. And then when I think about, okay, well, the narrative that a DAO needs to spin out is one that I think needs to be appealing in the same way. People want to be a part of Nouns because maybe they think it's going to be worth more in the future. But if you get into why people buy it, it's because they want to be a part of this thing. They want to be a part of this movement. In the same way that somebody wants to buy Nike because they want to be a part of being a Nike type of guy, I think. Being cool. I don't know. Josh, help me out here.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two ways to look at, ownership of DAOs. There's one from the DAO perspective, which is like, yeah, of course, I want 1,000 people to like just be doing work, right? In many cases, like that's actually just not the desire of the participant or the token holder. Like they're participating or coming into the thing from a much more like consumer angle, in which like with like consumer desires. And then I think there's also this understanding that like DAOs are networks, and we're building networks, and networks get increasingly valuable, like the bigger they are and the more nodes there are. So suddenly you have these things that like kind of by design and necessity need lots of attention and people. And that's, I think, just going to like continue to like bleed into what we like think of consumer experiences as today. They may look very different. One like kind of very unformed thought I have is that DAOs are kind of like driving the like consumerization of everything almost.
Well, that's like the thesis that TCG puts out, right? It's like you want to buy into a DAO that's a music label because everybody wants to be part of the music business. You want to buy into owning part of a golf course, or would it be cool for you to have a front row seat and participation in Y Combinator if you're interested in building startups? Like, I think that's interesting.
The word for this actually is prosumer, which is kind of one of those weird words, but it's like, I mean, I knew it from like music year, and I actually used to think that it just meant like slightly more pro than a consumer product. But what it actually means is like, it's a product that you both consume and produce with, which is exactly what DAOs and these networks are. They're prosumer products.
Jess, you're making a face right now. What's this face?
I like new words. I like Peacenode dropping the new words. That's all he does. He goes into group chat.
All
And
he does.
It's just this prosumer. That's all he does.
Peacenode is also a real Twitter degen, so you should definitely give Peacenode a follow. But wait, so I think there's a lot of words being thrown around, right? Prosumer, consumer, builder. I think maybe it's worth kind of unpacking, okay, what are the interactions between all these sort of persona types that you're talking about? And what does it actually have to do with these various token ecosystems? Like, why is it important to create a distinction between a consumer experience? And then, Jess, you mentioned earlier this idea of like a builder experience on the Nouns ecosystem. What is the actual difference there, and why does it matter?
I mean, my first reaction there is like, good luck talking about this in the abstract in any meaningful way. But I think like one of my favorite tweets is one that Aaron Wright put out a while back, which is like, DAOs aren't companies, they're networks, and networks are more valuable than companies. There's an intuitive belief in that, I think, and we can look at the Ubers and the Facebooks, et cetera, sort of examples of it. And so I think if our intention is to go build networks, the model, the structure needs to be one that can't scale. And there is, I think, one way of looking at that model is saying, okay, well, how do we go create more opportunities for people to do work to create value for this network? But I think the reality is that you don't need 1 billion people working on doing things. And so I think the lens of looking at DAOs through consumer is actually saying, okay, well, there's going to be a subset of people who are actually building the thing. There's going to be a subset of people who are maybe more managing or connecting. There's probably multiple personas that are going to exist in a network that you're building. If we look at C Club, we have our builders, we have a broader community, we have our strategic contributors, we have our collaborators, we have contributors themselves. And looking at those and designing for each of those personas is necessary. In the Nouns ecosystem, there's token holders and then people doing work for those token holders. And then there's everybody else, which is also, I think, maybe an interesting thing around Nouns is that the CCO model of it means that there's anybody can call them Nounish, anybody can identify with it, anybody can go join many of these spaces. And I think that's why I love the word prosumer that Peacenode's sharing here. And actually, that's maybe a really useful distinction, right? My belief and Peacenode's belief around what prosumer means is that it's actually just like a higher quality consumer product. And maybe that's one way of looking at DAOs, is it's just like a different way of working, right? And then the other way of saying it is actually, no, like there's this sort of dynamic of producing and consuming that's happening in these networks.
I think this idea of like what consumers want is one that's interesting and kind of gets at this difficulty that we all have in defining ownership and defining like what ownership means and what people want from ownership and how tokens represent that. I think like the collectibles is a good example of that. I think that, membership or subscription NFTs, like I think that there's so many superpowers that tokens have, and ownership is one of the ways that use it, that DAOs and organizations and others use it. And there's obviously a whole bunch of other ways and things that you can do. But I think like, again, the Nouns piece is interesting because there's owners in Nouns and then there's like all of these others around it. But I think that like what that ownership actually means and sort of what you can do with it, or like what you might be able to do with it in the future. And there's obviously all sorts of like challenges around that. But then the other piece, which kind of gets at the governance, is like, how active are people actually wanting to be as owners? And I think that that's that other piece of like, you talk about Nike, but it's like, sure, like I want to be able to say that like I own a pair, a part of like a brand that I'm really excited about, or that I was there at the very beginning of like some cool little niche music label that's now exploded, and I'm, part owner of that. But beyond sort of bragging rights, let's be honest, like I'm not going to get down into the nitty gritty. So I think that like that's another long-term piece, and also something that like organizations are struggling to communicate, again, Seed Club included.
I mean, so I have another tweet for this, Nicole, which I think is relevant, which is that people want ownership experiences, not ownership responsibilities.
Oh yeah, 1,000%.
But there is no brand that is relevant today on the internet that doesn't have a throng of passionate fans that are actually creating an exceptional amount of value for them. Same thing in crypto. If we sort of extend the network analogy beyond just this idea of like the internet or of platforms or of crypto itself and into this idea of human beings coming together around ideas and sharing ideas or taking action together, you start to see like networks being the value driver of absolutely everything. And it's not, not purely just technology. And so I think like there's this desire to be a part of something, but then also a consumer experience in a DAO isn't just consumption. I think it will also be, you want to feel like you're having an impact in some way. And I think that is one of the challenges, but it's also like the big opportunity. And so another thing that I think you see coming out of Nouns is this like broad accessibility and ownership, a funding model, and then specific ownership of the meme or provenance through actually holding tokens is creating the space for other people to sort of step in and say, well, I want to go do that. And if I'm going to go do it, and if there's interest and support from it, I'm going to get money behind it. And maybe I'll continue it. And if not, then I won't. And I think we're just seeing the early parts of that model kick off.
The one piece I think that's interesting, so like looking at some of the big whatever infrastructures or sort of like traditional media companies that we have now, whether it's Facebook and Instagram or Spotify or something like that. And like, I'm imagining like, what if like Spotify had come out of a Nounish model where like all of these like artists and musicians and fans and et cetera, like pooled capital. And then the various like technical tools, the distribution was built out of that. I think that the one, again, just kind of like breaks my brain a little bit. It's like, the creators and the workers and the people creating the value kind of want to have their cake and eat it too, in that like you do want ownership in the thing that you've contributed to being valuable. And yet, like you said, Jess, whatever that fire tweet is, like realistically, you probably want the ownership experience and value without the sort of full ownership participation. And I think that that's, I hope that this is the year where DAOs are able to communicate a little bit better for those that are making it, where it's like, okay, the people that are closest, that are contributing, whether it's through being fans and like consumers or prosumers, or whether it's the ones actually building, like how are those people participating in the value, but how does the token really extend that ownership? And I think that there's a lot of like space to be sort of shown and like distance to be shown in the ways that like there's DAOs and organizations where tokens are doing that. And then there's DAOs where tokens are doing a bunch of other things that are also like amazing, very cool superpowers, but are not that. And I think that that's been over the past year with all of the hype, it's been really easy to like conflate the two. And, I'm hoping that in this year, there's a little bit more direction in what some of those like actual tangible examples are.
Spotify is kind of an interesting example, right? You have like Spotify, the product, which like I would, never task like a network to try to come together and like figure out how to like create and solve. But then you actually do have like so much of the value that's like created on Spotify is the network of people creating playlists. It's artists, it's the people listening. And I think there's like a very strong argument to make that like that coordinated with a token could like fundamentally change like the value flow. And like, would Spotify have to be spending so much money on marketing and just like, throwing that into Facebook's pockets if they had like the network effect unlocks of tokens and like the participation incentives and creation incentives of tokens? Like I don't know, open question, but I think it is important to like separate the like network and the product or protocol or like thing that maybe like a smaller group of people would be better tasked with.
Joey from Backdrop responded to some tweets, right? I mean, trying to sort of get at this distinction between the network and where value is built or how value is built. There's a conversation around using Visa as an analogy. So Visa as a payment network and then all the economic activity that is supported by Visa. It says the DAO can build some standards or protocols to coordinate across all of the members or owners, but the primary place of production value capture is probably not at the DAO level. So I think that's kind of what we're seeing again in Nouns. In many ways, I think we see it in Seed Club. As we see, ideally, the networks we support become bigger and more valuable than Seed Club in the future. But yeah, it definitely feels like the evolution, and I think this is really what appeals to me about looking at DAOs through more of a consumer lens is that it's forcing an evolution of thinking in what we're building here. Is it a collective of people who are coming together just to do work, or is there a network and a brand or a meme that we're trying to go build towards? And I think we're just far more interested in the latter than the former, where I am at least.
I think, Jess, you had some tweet about governance, something around you have to make something that is worth governing.
Yeah, my hot take is like everybody wants to invest in picks and shovels and everybody wants to talk about governance and do governance roundups and look at all these great governance experiments. And I look at the things, either the projects that are going to be using those tools that are being built or the things that are being governed. I'm like, I don't want to own that. Why would somebody want to own that? To me, the only thing that matters, frankly, and this is obviously talking around book, that is our number one goal at C Club, is that we need to have valuable DAOs out in the world, things that people want to be a part of. It's the tagline we're using. Build something people want to be a part of. If we cannot build something that people want to be a part of, none of this stuff works. It doesn't matter about governing. It doesn't matter about building tools and infrastructure for it. It doesn't matter about hosting podcast conversations about how to go, Now, luckily, I think there are plenty of examples of things that people want to be a part of. Like, it's not like there's a doubt in my mind around being able to do it, but I don't know if that's truly been a big enough focus ultimately. And consumerization of DAOs or pragmatism around sustainability and things like revenue and how do you actually structure an organization so you actually can go build something. Josh is getting at this idea of like a random group of people on the internet's probably not the thing that's going to go build the next Spotify, but a small team might be, and yet community ownership of that at some point probably makes a ton of sense. And so we're talking about the wrong things, maybe focused on the wrong things, and the right things just seems so clear and is also such a big, heavy, uncertain lift. I don't know why we're focused on anything else.
I think that phenomenon that you're talking to regarding to like the picks and shovels too is just people who have been like so steeped in the industry that there actually is some like implicit marketing in all of that, right? Where people are thinking, okay, well, if I make this and put it out there for people to own, people will just inherently speculate on the value that it will create for the ecosystem. And that's like, maybe not low-hanging fruit. Obviously, it's not as easy as saying it or coming up with the idea. But yeah, getting outside of crypto and actually producing something valuable just for like people on the cultural level is, a whole nother thing, and is where I do think the value of DAOs is realized.
Yeah, I mean, we just come through a hyper-speculative phase where that was low-hanging fruit, right? Like you could launch something. If you launched something at the right time, it became valuable, you could sell the top and go live your life on an island or run away to some foreign country to stay out of the reach of law enforcement, like so many of our main characters of this last cycle have done. But I think the lens of like, how do we build long-term sustainable, valuable, ethical, moral organizations? I mean, there's a whole philosophy there that's maybe a different conversation. But like, yeah, I think there needs to be a there. I think what's interesting about the idea of like building something people want to be a part of is it sort of gets at one of the core insights I think we've had, which is that that's an incredible starting point. And it's a thing that many tools and products and other crypto networks just struggle with, right? Like you can fork Ethereum, but unless people want to use it and see value in it, it's not going to be valuable. And that's like the core premise of open source and of all these networks, right? It's not the technology most often that is the differentiator or the value creator. It is the communal belief. Matt Levine from Bloomberg said, it really articulated really well in saying that crypto is a social product, right? It is this mutual belief. That's what Bitcoin is. It's what Ethereum is. Yes, there's utility that layered on top of it that feeds that narrative. So the fact that you can just bootstrap value by having a small-ish group of people be like, oh, we believe this to be valuable. I mean, that is a superpower of tokens. I think what we've intuitively understood, and I think what the market more generally has learned now, is that that's not enough. Like there needs to be an evolution of just that to sustain it longer and create longer term value. And I think that's the fun stuff right now. And again, it's core to this idea of how do we go build valuable DAOs.
Going back to, how people actually want to be a part of it, I think that there's going to be something that a lot of DAOs have to figure out. And again, it's a question that we're thinking about a lot, which is like, what are the ways that you make that as easy and entertaining as possible, and also like as sort of like temporal? There was like that sort of interesting exchange that you had in that tweet of like, you have to know how to get in, but also leave, or like you have to sort of know like with the token how you can come in and have a token, but also what you can do when you're done with it. And I know that, Jonathan Hillis from Cabin sort of responded that he was interested in infinite games. And I appreciate sort of the philosophy behind that. But, the reality is if we look at our lives that like, there's not a lot of infinite games that we're playing. And there's a lot of pieces that like are, like the right stage for different parts of your life and that we all sort of like dip in and out of. And I think that that's something that I think a lot about, which is like, how do you make it so that for that like 80+%, it's something that you can play when you're ready or play like when the time comes, and that it sort of makes it like evergreen. My personal belief is that like a large percentage of those token holders aren't going to necessarily be doing the infinite game. Peace, how do you define a mini game?
Well, it's like, okay, imagine the infinite game is Mario Party. It's a game of mini games. It's genius. It's super hard. It's like every new thing, they're like, here's like some new rules in a new little game. But then like once you learn them, it's actually pretty fun. I've only played a couple times, but I had a blast. And the same thing like too, like with cell phone games, play a game, that's great, but the mini games are always better than the actual game. So the more you can stack them, I think the better.
The mini games are not better than the actual game. What? Maybe in certain instances, like the largest, most popular games in the world are, I guess maybe Minecraft is you could argue and Roblox. Okay, I take it back. These are all mini games designing. It's all downloadable content. The thing that John's trying to get at is when he talks about infinite games is there's an incredible book called Finite and Infinite Games, right? And it's pushing at that. And so I think like that is very much like the intention behind building a network is creating mechanisms, rules, protocols that allow for people to coordinate for the broader, more meta good for the infinite. So I think that is very much right. I just don't believe that trying to design tokens as in-game points is the right focus unless there is sort of a more meta focus here. And I think it comes down to the fact that you can't feed yourself off in-game points. Right. And so there is like a pragmatism. So when I think about building valuable DAOs, I think there just needs to be an understanding of how this is truly an infinite game. It's an infinite game if there's ways for you to continue to fund the growth and creation within this network. And I have really yet to see a points-based token model make that happen. And instead, I think actually leads to more of the Ponzi type schemes than not, which we can see in something like a step in. Right. I'm not saying that's a Ponzi. I'm just saying that maybe that's, I don't know enough about it, or play to earn, or yield farming, right? There's just like a lack of sustainability there that's been proven out. Like these are games that have been more like in-game point rewards that are incentivizing micro actions rather than aligning incentives at the more meta, which I think is what great community tokens will do, which is what an announced token will do, which is what I hope the C Club token can continue to evolve into.
Well, I think like leaning heavily on that video game design piece, actually, it's interesting to think about like when you look at the different types of video games that are out there, and like the ones that are free are often, I mean, from my perhaps biased opinion, are often like sort of much less interesting as far as like the design and the thought behind the narrative and the thought behind the experiment. And, versus like when you have to sort of fork over an initial payment and there's more like sort of investment upfront and the experience that you get and the thought that goes behind it. And so I think that like, that's something that like you're making an investment in and you're wanting to be there for, a period of time. And I think that like similarly, like you said, Jess, where it's something that you're just kind of coming in and you're like pressing a button or you're like doing something to kind of like just participate in this mechanism where it's like, play to earn or something where you're like a gear turner versus somebody who is like meaningfully participating for a long period of time. I think that that's, to me, like I see an interesting map between like the different ways that people, because like video games are not like one size fits all. There's a lot of different ways that people think about game theory and that they design those experiences. And so I think that's the other piece that is interesting to look at is like what type of video game and like what type of like model are you leaning on? And yeah, we've seen experiments that mapped, I think, to like a lot of different ones.
It's funny how much I love the idea of the consumer experience in DAOs and how little I love the idea of DAOs as games and mini games. And I don't know why. Like, I think we're going to see a number of our projects do those sort of things, and I'm excited for those experiments. It just...
I don't think that DAOs can be mini games. They just can't be like Myst. Like you can't just be like wandering around, explore, looking for a clue kind of thing, you know? It's got a...
okay, so it's like, at what layer of the stack does the game come in? And I think in like engaging people and bringing them. I mean, I was just reading Nikita Baer, who is the founder of Gas App, I think, and he did TBH, and you just see like the most viral app, it's this tiny 3-person team that's beating all the other apps in the App Store, and it's purely around just being obsessed and brilliant and on getting people in. And there's all these little hooks that people are building or that they've built to get people in and test it, and et cetera. And it feels slightly evil, but maybe applied for good. It's good. I don't know about the ethics of that app. Don't know enough about it. Could be cool. Just kind of sus, but probably the right approach to say, okay, we want to get people into this consumer type network. That's maybe where the game lives.
Well, and I think the world building, like how you think about the narrative and the way that you tell that story. And I think that some do that really well. And I tend to think that it's ones where there's been kind of more like thought behind it versus ones where that's not as much of a priority. And it's much more just about sort of like press the button or in the point. And yeah, to me, that piece doesn't really excite me that much.
This seems like a great topic for a future episode. What is actually the functional difference between a DAO as a game and a DAO as a consumer experience?
This is the challenge, right? We need to talk about these things abstractly, but the only way we actually move them forward is through actual experimentation and building. And I think like when you try to get into more specifics, like that's really where the proof is in the pudding kind of lives. So, I mean, I have a question. I have a last question here, maybe, that I'm really interested in knowing, which is like, what's your desert island video game? The one video game that if you were locked on a desert island that you would play for the rest of your days.
Are you there by yourself, or do you have friends?
Oh, yeah, by yourself. But you have internet connection, so you can play with your friends remotely if you need to.
Mine would be Halo or Halo Live.
Oh shit!
Pete's got me down the nostalgia path with Mario Party, so I think I'm going to go Super Smash.
Yeah, we've been playing a lot of Zelda. We played a lot of Zelda over Christmas break, but I love a quest, so Zelda.
I'm a Civilization type of guy. Give me that turn-based strategy. Let's go.
Damn. Yeah, man. Civ 3 was really good. Also a big fan of Age of Empires 2. Okay, but actually neither of those would be my game. I'm not going to lie. It would probably be Tetris or this game that I'm obsessed with right now called Superbox, which is like Tetris with numbers. It's amazing.
Oh, peace.
Peacenode's a Sudoku type of guy.
Sudoku. Oh my god.
I'm not even like a, maybe I am. Maybe I'm just discovering myself.
Peace's answer is literally just a book of Sudoku challenges.
Let's get it. I want to order Peacenode a microphone. I don't know, like a door lock or like a rug.
Like WD-40
and the Sudoku book. Yeah.
Oh god damn, this squeaky ass setup. All right.
Just a little bit of grease.
Oh my god. That's it. That's the end right there. That's it.
All right.
Thanks for listening to Inside Seed Club. If you liked what you heard today, please rate us and leave us a review. This helps other Web3 builders discover these insights. Subscribe to Inside Seed Club to get the latest episode dropped right into your feed. And let us know what you think on Twitter. We're at Seed Club HQ. See you on the internet.